My understanding of transitional justice is that it's an approach or discipline that accepts that societies emerging from conflict need to take certain steps to address the past. Such countries need to take steps to take care of the needs of victims and redress the suffering that they have endured. And they also have to deal with perpetrators who've committed heinous crimes. But it's often done in a context where it's not business as usual. It's often done in countries where institutions, particularly the judiciary and the security sector, and other institutions of state have been largely crushed, where institutions often have to be rebuilt from scratch, where institutions who have carried out abuses need to be seriously reformed. In some situations, the devastation has been so dramatic that you're not dealing with just a few hundred or a few thousand cases, you're dealing with tens of thousands of cases, hundreds of thousands of matters which the normal system simply cannot deal with. And so transitional justice attempts to engage in an integrated approach to ensure that there will be some accountability, there will be some reforms, and there will be some redress or reparations. Obviously South Africa has been through its own past, which has involved discrimination and quite terrible repression. And through the mid-1990s, the different factions came together to come up with a way to deal with the past and engage in nation building. And that model, which involved a number of processes, people simply think it was about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and our amnesty and the work of Archbishop Tutu. And yes, that was very important work, but it wasn't just about that. It was about painstaking negotiations, it was about compromises that had to be made. It was about individuals such as Nelson Mandela reaching out to all sectors of society and engaging in acts of symbolic reconciliation. And it was about painstaking work in reaching out to communities and creating new institutions. That program is still ongoing. We've started it, but it's going to take probably a few generations to complete. And the South African model is often referred to as the gold standard of transitional justice, because it's seen as a very successful model, and in some respects it was. But I don't think we should put the blinkers on and regard it as completely successful, because we did make mistakes. And frankly, the reference to the rainbow, the miracle of the Rainbow Nation, is sometimes misplaced. Because if you look at our transition, and I think it's true to say that our transition probably started when Nelson Mandela and the other political prisoners were released from jail in early 1990. Sadly, the years from 1990 up until our democratic elections in 1994 represented the most violent period of our democratic history. More people were violently killed in ongoing political violence in those 4.5 years than in the rest of the apartheid years put together. We estimate that close to 17,000 individuals were killed in assassinations, in drive-by shootings, in mob violence. Those years were terrible years. We really were on the brink of no return. And if we weren't brought back from that brink towards the end of 93 and the beginning of 94, South Africa today would look like a very different place. We could have descended into terrible civil war. Thankfully that didn't happen, but we have to acknowledge that our transition grew out of that violence. And that's why we made certain compromises, such as the Truth for Amnesty process. And yes, in that respect it was a success, but to suggest that it was seamless and non-violence is simply not the case. Although we had this Truth for Amnesty and we did put much on the table, the fact is that many victims are still looking for answers. Many families are still wondering where their loved ones are. And we're still having to litigate in the courts to force the prosecutors to take these cases up. The prosecutors do not want to take these cases up. In fact, we've discovered evidence that they were instructed by the politicians to suppress those cases. We've had to go to court to compel the prosecutors to take these cases forward, and that explains why less than a handful of cases have gone to court. Sadly, reparations has been less than adequate. Many victims who suffered have yet to receive adequate reparations. So yes, the South African model is an interesting one, and is one in which I think should be closely studied, but I wouldn't suggest that it is the model that should be copied uncritically. Well, I think such huge challenges remain that there will be no shortage of work for the Africa Group. Regrettably, if we look at the track record throughout Africa, and regardless of where you look, whether it be South Africa, Uganda, Kenya, the DRC, they all have very, very poor track records of dealing with past atrocities. Few cases get investigated, and even fewer cases are prosecuted. I think the Africa Group is well placed to make strategic interventions, and really they should start to advise these governments on how to build capacity and skills, and to get their own cases off the ground. We know that there's a lack of capacity, we know there's a lack of resources and finance, but also there's the question of political will. And we think that issues around resources and finance and capacity, those are variables we can do something about. But it's the question of political will that is the most challenging. And in all the countries I've mentioned, and many others, that really is the biggest problem. Is the question of persuading government leaders to do the right thing. And really, if I had to identify the most important task for the Africa Group, it's to engage with political leaders and to persuade them that it is their responsibility to ensure that these cases happen, and it's their responsibility to provide their investigators, their police forces, their prosecutors and their courts with the support, and the political support in particular, to make these cases happen, because without that political support you can't expect subordinates to work in such a context.